Welcome, everybody. This is the beginning of our Earth Week events. So first and foremost, I would like to welcome everybody, faculty, students, and colleagues. I would first and foremost like to thank President Schilling for being here and for assisting with the organization of the events for the week, and in particular, really allowing us to bring in some really amazing speakers and researchers who are really, I think, in my personal opinion, at the forefront of some differing areas around the title of our discussion today, which is Ecology, Cosmology, and Interconnectedness. And for some of us, those might be very disparate or diverse words that maybe we haven't really taken into much consideration in our own personal lives, but hopefully the task for today is to really delve into what specifically ecology and cosmology mean as they pertain and relate to one another. So welcome everybody, and we're going to get started. And as I said, feel free to use the chat and I'll refer to that throughout the discussion. So first and foremost, Merlin Sheldrake is a biologist with a background in plant sciences, microbiology, ecology, and the history and philosophy of science. He received a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama, where he was a pre-doctoral research fellow of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. Merlin's research ranges from fungal biology to the history of Amazonian ethnobotany, to the relationship between sound and form in resonant systems. And then very importantly, Merlin is the author of Entangled Life. And for those of you who have not come across this book, I highly, highly recommend it. Secondly, welcome Rupa Marya. Some of you might remember Rupa from last year. A physician, an activist, a writer, mother, and composer. She's an associate professor of medicine at UCSF and co-founder of the Do No Harm Coalition. Her work sits at the nexus of climate, health, and racial justice, where her work seeks to decolonize food and medicine. And additionally, Rupa is the co-author of Inflamed, Deep Medicine and Anatomy of Injustice. And again, another really incredible book that I highly recommend to everybody. And then last but not least, Fred Prozenza. Fred is a professor emeritus of behavioral ecology in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State University, where he directed an award-winning research group that pioneered understanding of how learning through metabolically mediated flavor feedback relationships and experiences in utero and early in-life influence foraging behavior, and how behavior links the health of soil, plants, herbivores, and humans. And again, Fred is an author of the book Nourishment: What Animals Can Teach Us About Our Nutritional Wisdom. So first and foremost, thank you to the three of you. And it's really amazing to have you here with us and hopefully in collaboration and community with one another. So thank you. So before we go into a dialogue, the way that we're going to lay this out is I'll ask the three of you to briefly introduce the title today. So Ecology, Cosmology, and Interconnectedness. So I'll give you about 5 to 6 minutes to do so. And from there, really just moving into dialogue. So between what each of you have referenced in your introduction, and hopefully from there, really navigating some territory that's going to be new for a lot of us, and really expand on how we approach this notion of ecology. But first and foremost, before I stop talking for the remainder of the hour and 15 minutes, I'd like to briefly introduce how we might approach this dialogue. So our task today broadly is to give context to, as I said, the notion of ecology, our relationship to both to and of ecology, and how the shaping of ecology forms our worldview. In this respect, we might start by suggesting what is ecological is intimately cosmological. And with this, we might point toward the relationship, or one specific relationship, between bloodroot and ants as an example of this intimacy of a relational congruence. For instance, ants do not eat bloodroot. Instead, they pick up their seeds and carry them to their nest. Each bloodroot seed contains a small outgrowth called the iliosome that grows outside the seed coat, which is not part of the germ. This outgrowth is then fed to the larvae of the ants. The seed retains its potential for germination, which is discarded from the nest, where bloodroot then spreads out through lowland forests. These plants connect subterraneously where they branch from the same plant, which continues to grow each year. Where the ants come, they move the plant via their seeds, which provide the conditions for new colony of bloodroot to develop. In this respect, not only do ants depend on the bloodroot depend on the ants. Therefore, just as bloodroot grow rhizomatically in the soil, they are mobile as exterior to the soil, and so move rhizomatically with the movement of the ants. In this respect, the relationship between bloodroot and ants constitutes a collective rhizomatic structure that is interspecies dependent. As such, the relationship and interdependence of bloodroot and ants form a sympathetic relation, a process of entering into via interior and exterior domains of production and maintenance. It is through ecological participation that we are afforded a greater cosmological understanding, and further through the interplay of cosmos and ecology, a sense of implicit relation, and what hopefully we're going to come to is this idea of interconnectedness. So what better way to discuss the notion of intersection and relation and our place as participating within these vast rhizomatic networks is to bring about a conversation with these three unique thinkers, Merlin, Rupa, and Fred. So hopefully that gives us some context for the conversation. So first and foremost, I'd like to hand it over to Merlin for about 5 or 6 minutes. So welcome, Merlin.
Well, thank you, Sam. And thanks everyone for coming. And thanks, Fred, and thanks, Rupa, for being here. I'm excited to have this conversation. I really like this title. This is a fertile collection of words for me. And so I'm happy to riff on these themes for a moment. So I always find it helpful to remember, I'm an ecologist part of the time, and a lot of my thinking is rooted in ecological research and in ecological thinking and worldviews. And the word ecology was coined by a biologist called Ernst Haeckel in 1869, I believe. And what it comes from is the Greek word oikos, and oikos is the word for household, i.e. the inhabitants of the house, or dwelling place. And I find that helpful to come back to, that we think about ecology as referring to not just the web of relations that sustains an entity, but the place in which they are sustained. And of course, that place is not just a backdrop like a diorama in the American Museum of Natural History. That place is made by numberless other lives unfolding around them. So, so I find this helpful to remember. And it brings a kind of intimacy and a homeliness to this subject, that this is a study of where we live and who we live with. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about fungi, thinking about microbes and organisms that live in sub-visible realms that are difficult for us to access with our unaided senses. And one of the striking things about these lives, when you start to look at them, is that it becomes clear that it's impossible to think about cleanly bounded individuals when one takes a sustained look at the living world. We are, of course, planets with regard to our microbiomes. Many of you will have heard about the quadrillions of bacteria and fungi that live in us, that live on us, without which we couldn't grow, we couldn't behave as we do, and relate as we do. So we are, in some sense, part microbe. There are more cells that we carry around that are not ours than those that are technically ours, which instantly raises the question of what is ours after all. And once we start to look at that, it becomes very disconcerting. And I've spent time in this disconcerting space. I enjoy spending time in this disconcerting space. I find it challenges some received categories that maybe need to be challenged. But basically, where this leads to for me is that when we look at the biological world, or look at the world, a living world, from the perspective of a biologist or any biologically inclined inquirer, it becomes clear that individuality is not a natural fact, but rather a category that depends on one's point of view. And so what we choose to call an individual at any moment, of course, we need individuals in human societies. Individuality is a very used and abused trope. We need individuality we need to define an individual to be able to do our tax returns, to get a passport, to be able to count in censuses, and so take responsibility for our actions in the eyes of the law, all sorts of things. And there are all sorts of attendant problems that come with the ways that that individuality is either defined, circumscribed, celebrated, denounced, and so forth. So, so I find this microbial way into the question helpful. That's just because it's the way that I've taken myself, and so for me feels right to bring up in an introductory moment. But then to come to lean to, how does this relate to cosmological thinking? How could this form part of a bigger question, a bigger picture of the universe, not just the living organisms on Earth? And for this, I find it very helpful to think in terms of processes. So we are all processes in time. The cells in your body that make up your body today are made of different molecules and different atoms to the cells that made up your body 5 years ago. And when you look, boil it down, everything is in fact a process. Even at the level of a molecule or an atom, come down to the structure of an atom, and what you find is not some hard, enduring stuff, but rather energy trapped within fields or vibrating within fields, let's say. And so what this processual view does is it turns being into becoming. And becoming is never becoming alone. We are always becoming with. We are always becoming with any other number of other entities also becoming in time. And so this view of a processual view where we are always beings in a state of becoming, that we are becoming with, because one can never become alone, that we are always braiding through time with other entities in a process of becoming. I find this very helpful. And I find it helpful because it takes us out of a view of ecology as some parochial phenomenon that refers to life on Earth, and into a full cosmological story where we're dealing in some sense with a giant organism that had some kind of genesis point that is unfolding in time, composed of very large entities made up of smaller entities and smaller entities, all becoming in time and all becoming with. And it's that becoming with, for example, that would allow the elements of hydrogen and oxygen to form a molecule like water. So this is maybe where I'll leave it and hand it over. Thank you.
It's a very beautiful introduction, Merlin, and so many components that we could literally spend the rest of the hour and however long we have together, but reminds me of this notion of concreescence that Whitehead uses, referring to this notion of process, but I'd like to maybe come back to that if we can. But before we do so, I'm going to hold it and turn it over to Rupa. So Rupa, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you again.
Hello, and I'm so honored to be here. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Merlin. I'm a big fan of your work, and I just love fungi, except when I find it in my patient's lungs in the ICU, and it's not ever convenient. But I'm, here as a physician. I work as a hospital medicine doctor at UCSF. And I am the wife of a farmer now. So my life has been, I said I was always looking for a man to treat me like dirt. And so I found one, and it's been wonderful. So he's literally planted me in the ground and transformed all these intuitions that I've known as an artist, as someone who plays music and has traveled around the world, really looking at the interconnection between what makes us human and what makes us healthy, what makes us thrive, what makes systems thrive. And that's sort of been the zone I've been in. But what you say, Merlin, makes me think about the explorations Raj Patel and I took in our book Inflamed, when we were looking more carefully at some of the language and these concepts. So when you talk about these kind of parochial ideas of ecology versus something that's what we call deep ecology, the ecology that has nothing to do with human centeredness, but that has to do with these processes that unfold around us and that we are deeply a part of, a minuscule part of. That's where Raj and I started to coin this idea of deep medicine. So this idea that health itself was not a characteristic of one individual thing. It's a phenomenon that emerges when systems are harmonizing in a certain way, or creating a harmony that brings more benefit to more things, this sense of thriving. And so for us, when I think about that, that yes, our gut, the microbiota, all of the organisms that live on and around us that have way more genes, genetic tools than we have in our own human genome, that we could not live without. So our fetuses, us as fetal entities, would not develop properly without the microbes in the folds of our intestines at 14 weeks, or what becomes our primordial intestines. So when we think about that our proper development of our brains, of our immune systems, of our endocrine systems, so many of the systems which we can look at separately, but are really deeply interconnected within our own bodies, are 100% dependent on the presence of these organisms. We would not exist in health without them. So that starts to ask the question, as Merlin was saying, well, then what are we without these things? And are we actually ourselves without them? And it extends the boundaries and concepts of the self to include this picture of, I guess the best word we found was the word holobiont, so that we are like coral reefs, we are like lichen, we are assemblages of organisms that create the sense of I, we. It's almost like the concept of I as a singular I should be thrown out, because although I cannot speak for my microbes, I am myself an entity, and my being, my well-being is completely dependent on them. And when we think about how we're taught in medical school about the microbes on us or around us, or even the immune system itself, which is completely dialed in and tuned by all of these microbes, we use the language of colonial conquest that has perverted our minds and not let us able to, has prevented us from being able to see our deep interconnections with one another and with the web of life, where we are situated. Because these ideas of coloniality that have perverted human imagination for the last 600 years have required a language and an architecture of thought based in systems of domination. And they prevent us from actually seeing the interrelationship. And so when I learned about the immune system, I learned that there were white blood cells running around like little police officers, policing the borders of myself, that there was a self and the other. But in fact, there's much more of a blurred line between those things, that there are entities that are neither self nor other, that are completely required. And you see that the boundaries of the self sort of blur as opposed to a hard line. And the boundaries of identity blur. And so instead of disconcerting, I find that quite liberating, because those are the spaces where I start to see that I am the earth, that I am the person who's being right now swept up in the streets of Oakland because they just happen to be poor and unhoused under this constructed system where, 300 years ago or 200 years ago, where I'm sitting right now in San Francisco, There were never unhoused people. There were never hungry people. The Ohlone people who lived here for upwards of 10,000 years didn't have those constructs, didn't have that violence. And that violence was constructed. So the limits of our language and ability to understand these things have been prescribed by dynamics of power and dynamics of history. And they have perverted how we understand or the abilities of our imaginings in science, what questions we ask, how we ask the questions, how we come to know these things have been limited. And what I love about the microbiome and the science of the microbiome, and not only just the gut microbiome, but the soil and the root, the plant microbiome, all of these things, is that these little invisible creatures who are much more highly successful from an evolutionary standpoint than we are teaching us and showing us the limitations of explanatory power, of Cartesian dualism, of these Enlightenment era thoughts that have limited our ability to function well on planet Earth and have ultimately led to the destruction of, the ecosystems that we live in. So when I think of the immune system now, based on the research that Raj and I did around inflammatory disease and why everybody we know, including most of us, will grow up having some sort of inflammatory disease, whether it's diabetes or cardiovascular disease or Alzheimer's, or as I'm watching someone right now die of COVID. These are all diseases where the immune system's inflammatory responses are being set off to sound out like a full suite of inflammation. That the immune system is actually not policing self versus other. It is harmonizing us to the world around us. And either that harmony is dissonant because it's reacting to damage. Either that harmony is creating something where in a toxic set of exposures, the immune system will sound out inflammation. In a set of exposures that is nutritive and creates the possibility for life to thrive, those systems don't have people who live in those systems, or immune systems aren't expressing inflammatory disease. So I kind of see the proof is in the pudding, and I'm grateful to be in the soup and in the stew and have all love and respect for all those invisible creatures that have been revolutionizing the way that we think about our relationship to each other and our relationship to the web of life. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor to hear you speak. Oftentimes I'm so inspired by some of the things you're able to pull from. But before I maybe delve into some questions, I'm going to resist that temptation, and I'm going to hand it over to Fred. So Fred, welcome, and it's great for you to be here with us today.
Well, thank you, Sam. It's great to be here with you and Merlin and Rupa, and I can relate to everything both of you had to say. I'm going to pass along some thoughts from over the years that I've spent involved in these areas, and I want to begin with ecology and cosmology. We typically think of ecology as the study of relationships among organisms and environments. But I think of ecology as the ever-changing nature of relationships among organisms and environments. Why? Because the only constant in life is change. The world is constantly changing, yet we typically regard change as anomalous, a kind of transitory disruption in a normally constant world. Even Albert Einstein was reluctant to accept change. When he introduced the cosmological constant into the general theory of relativity, what that amounted to was a refusal to accept change as the guiding principle organizing the evolution of the universe, and it was, as he later recounted, the greatest blunder of his career. Closer to home, when hurricanes and floods devastate our cities, when droughts bake landscapes and dry up massive bodies of water like Lakes Powell and Meade in the US, when great volcanoes erupt, knocking down trees, covering the earth with a layer of volcanic ash for miles around, we think how strange it is that nature should misbehave so. It is, we tell ourselves, a momentary lapse, a kind of geological tantrum. Soon our old planet will regain its composure, its sameness. But in fact, it's our brief tenure on Earth that deludes us. Our time here is too short to see continents crash together and tear apart, mountains rise and fall, vast deserts replace oceans, climates warm and cool endlessly, plant and animal species coming and going like the ever-changing colors and shapes of a kaleidoscope. Change then isn't the exception to the rule, it's the only rule. Any organization, any civilization, any species, if it is to survive, has got to be able to cope with change. So how well do they do? The average lifetime of a Fortune 500 company is less than half that of a human lifetime. During the past century, the lifetime of an S&P 500 company shrank by over 50 years, from 67 years in the 1920s to just over 15 years today. Human civilizations typically survive for 10 generations or 250 years as they evolve through 5 stages. They begin as pioneers characterized by enterprise, shared values and vision, and end in decadence, divisiveness, delusion, and utter lack of shared vision and values in the face of wickedly complex ecological, economic, social, and political challenges. Historically, the demise of a civilization was tragic for the people of the society, but not for Homo sapiens generally. That's not necessarily the case nowadays, given the shared face of people globally. Plant and animal species have lifetimes too of a few to several million years. Paleontologists tell us 99% of the species that have ever visited Earth are now extinct. So what will become of our species, Homo sapiens? No one knows, but at this moment on this planet, the question isn't whether life will continue in the Garden of Eden. The question for us is whether or not Homo sapiens will continue to live with other life in the Garden of Eden. With that, I'll turn briefly to cosmology and interconnectedness. And I recently watched a Novel special on quantum entanglement, this bizarre phenomenon concerning how subatomic particles are intimately linked, even if separated by billions of light years in space. Despite their vast separation, a change induced in one instantly affects the other. All the tests of this hypothesis, which were the subject of this NOVA special, support the theory of quantum entanglement and the belief that everything in the universe is interconnected at the quantum level. Separateness is an illusion. That reminds me of a marvelous essay titled "On an Apparent Intention in the Fate of the Individual," written by the German philosopher Schopenhauer. He begins by pointing out that when we've reached an advanced age and look back over our life, it can seem to have had a consistent order or plan, as though composed by some novelist. And events that when they'd occurred seemed accidental and of little moment turn out to have been indispensable factors in the composition of a consistent plot. So Schopenhauer asks, who composed the plot? He suggests that just as our dreams are composed by an aspect of ourself of which our consciousness is unaware, so too our whole life. And just as people whom we will have met, apparently by mere chance, became leading agents in the structure of our life, so too we will have served unknowingly as agents, giving meaning to the lives of others. The whole thing harmonizes like a grand symphony, with everything unconsciously organizing everything else. Schopenhauer concludes it is as though our lives are the features of a great dream of a single dreamer, in which all the dream characters dream too. Everything links to everything else, moved by the will to life, which is the universal will in nature. I'll conclude with some thoughts on ecology, cosmology, and interconnectedness. Aldo Leopold began his book, A Sand County Almanac, by noting, there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. These essays are the delights and dilemmas of one who cannot. His book is a moving account of how our detachment from nature is wreaking havoc on communities. Yet despite his eloquent pleas, the changes human societies have fashioned since his death, nearly 75 years ago, have been nothing short of breathtaking. From the plundering of plants and animals and indigenous peoples globally during the era of 19th century manifest destiny, right up till today, we are now being consumed by changes we wrought and consequences we did not foresee. Leopold concludes, we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So I ask, how can we move away from money-centric societies built on scarcity and competition to communities that nurture one another and our relationships with Mother Earth out of shared abundance and cooperation? How can we transition from black and white opinions of what constitutes food for humans to more nuanced views of the sacredness of all life, plants and animals alike, who are all conscious and we can argue sentient, and our dependence on their lives for our nourishment? And finally, how can we move away from fossil fuels to clean energy and in the process create opportunities to produce foods locally in ways that nurture relationships among soil, water, plants, herbivores, farmers, ranchers, and consumers? I would conclude by saying the challenges we face in addressing these, quote, critical issues have little to do with the issues and everything to do with healing the divides that polarize and isolate us. The irony to me is that transcending boundaries that we create is addressing the really critical issue. And we do that by declaring love, not war, on one another and the landscapes we inhabit. Finally, in her beautiful essay titled The Serviceberry, Robin Wall Kimmerer writes, "Gratitude is the thread that connects us in a deep relationship, simultaneously physical and spiritual, as our bodies are fed and spirits nourished by the sense of belonging, which is the most vital of all foods. Gratitude creates a sense of abundance, the knowing that you have what you need. In that climate of sufficiency, our hunger for more abates, and we take only what we need in respect for the generosity of the giver." She concludes, "Continued fealty to economies based on competition for manufactured scarcity, rather than cooperation around natural abundance, is now causing us to face the danger of producing real scarcity, evident in growing shortages of food and clean water, breathable air, fertile soil. Climate change is a product of this extractive economy and is forcing us to confront the inevitable outcome of our consumptive lifestyle, genuine scarcity for which the market has no remedy. Regenerative economies which cherish and reciprocate the gift are the only path forward. To replenish the possibility of mutual flourishing, we need an economy that shares the gifts of the earth, following the lead of our oldest teachers, the plants." And in concluding, I reckon our oldest teachers, the plants, transform dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants transform soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies that nourish all life below and above ground, which is what I spent my lifetime studying. Okay, with that, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be here with all of you guys.
Thank you, Fred. Much appreciated. Again, I'm going to resist the temptation to ask too many questions. And I think what you really ended on here really gets to 2 points that both Rupa and Merlin individually are working with. And I think we can look to 2 different examples. And I think the Do No Harm Coalition and this idea of deep medicine, Rupa, would be an example of how we can talk to what Fred was just alluding to, if I'm not mistaken. And then additionally, what Merlin was referring to in terms of these deep fungal networks and different ways and types of knowing. And I think those are 2 different places that we could definitely, let's say, diverge to. But I want to hand it over to you first and foremost, Rupa, because I think you can speak to what Fred was referring to most accurately.
Yes, thank you, Fred. That was so beautifully articulated. We are working, we have an organization called the Deep Medicine Circle that is working to advance what an economy based in cultural sanity looks like, or what an economy of care looks like. And one of our first cornerstone projects is called Farming as Medicine. So people are talking about food as medicine all over the place right now. But when you talk about the food as medicine problem or issue in the national conversation, there's a whole White House panel on nutrition and all these things and food and hunger, but no one was talking about the farming. Like, how do we create the food? And the reality is that the Ohlone people, the native people here, had exactly what you were describing for thousands of years. So there were systems that were in balance, that the plants and the animals and all of those entities were fed, were nourished in that system. And that it is the mindset of colonial capitalist extraction, of dominance, and of creating, as you said, manufactured scarcities that have impoverished us in many ways, and that we argue drives the scourge of chronic inflammatory disease. And when we describe it in our book, we don't only talk about inflammation in the human body, but inflammation in the body of the earth. What we're seeing with these floods and fires, how she's speaking to us very clearly. And so this farming as medicine model is exciting, because what we did is we took the food system today and flipped it on its head. So what that means is we start with moving land back to native people's hands. So on this 38-acre farm where we are working in San Gregorio, California, this farm has been blasted by paraquat for many years. It was fallow for about 8 years. And it's on this river that goes right to the ocean. And Portola, when he landed on the San Francisco Peninsula looking for Monterey, they keep getting lost, walked up with his crew and camped at the mouth of this river, and they all got sick. And it was the people of that tribelet who lived there. We found a village site. So the first thing we did when we got access to this land, at the request of the elders, was to do an archaeological survey, because we saw these bones coming up from the gopher tribulations, and they look like old human bones. And so there is, in fact, a village site there on the land, so that we marked where we weren't going to farm and where we were going to create some food. And the people who lived there brought their food and medicine down to heal the people who were sick for 4 days. And that's documented in those diaries. And what they got in return was genocide. What they got in return was not what they were used to, which was a culture of reciprocity. I give you medicine, you give me medicine. We give each other, then we mutually benefit from this relationship. These are deep ecologies, right? So these are systems of relationships that enhance everyone's well-being. And it's not to say that people didn't have intertribal warfare and intertribal dynamics, but there was a way and a system of relating to the land and the beings that were there, the grizzly bears that were like 18 feet tall here in California, the whales, the salmon that were running, the beaver that was there. All of those relationships are gone now. And so what we're looking at is land back, is not just returning land to indigenous hands, but working together to support the revitalization and reintroduction of these species. So we are working to bring beaver back to this watershed. We're removing the invasive species from the watershed. The elders want to bring the tule elk back to the watershed and remove the cattle, bring the native disturbance regimes back to that space, the fire, the elk, the grazing animals. So it's exciting to see that. So that's the first part of our farming, is to restore those ecologies and ecological relationships from human to more than human. The second part is that we frame farmers as stewards of health, because the way that farmers farm will determine whether or not we will ultimately be healthier or not healthy. So our farmers prioritize the health of the soil, the vitality and biodiversity of the soil, from the micro to the macrobiology. We farm with techniques that blend agroecology together with traditional ecological knowledge from our native practitioners and what they're teaching on how to manage the plant and the soil life and the water on the site. The third thing we do, and with that, we actually pay our farmers like healthcare workers. We believe that farmers should be paid and uplifted for stewarding our health, not just through the creation of nutrient-dense food, but through the stewarding of all of the entities that are required. Our farm is so awesome right now, and this is our second year farming, that the red-legged frogs, which are endangered in our area, jump up and hang out in our pepper rows, because that's how good the ecology is on the soil. It's beautiful to see how we insist that the riparian corridor is actually the engine of the whole farm. So we have to care for it to care for the farm. We don't separate these things. The third part is that we decommodify all of our food. So if food has been made scarce, we see that food has been used as a weapon to coerce the labor of the working class all over the world, and has been used specifically by the United States and by Europe as an entity of colonial empire to flood systems, to make people dependent on external food system. So one of the first things colonial forces do is destroy the local food and medicine knowledge. And so to decommodify food is to remove that market mentality. All the food we grow, we give away. So in our first season, we were working with about 2 acres of land. We have a rooftop farm in Oakland and this other farm that we're moving back to native hands. But in that land, we grew and gave away 36,000 pounds of food that's now been registered organic because it's important to the communities we give it to. And we will be on track to do about 72,000 pounds of food this year, opening up another acre and a quarter, just doing the kind of farming that we are, which is, you could call it, I call it more organic. It could be called regenerative. It could be called traditional ecological knowledge. It could be called many things, but it's very earth loving and supportive of all the entities that are bringing the vitality to the land. And then the fourth part is when food has been decommodified from this capitalist crisis of thought and imagination, it can really re-enter the sacred relationality, what you spoke to of generosity. It can really enter that relationship that we have had, all of our human ancestors have had with these seeds that we have all had a place in stewarding through these ice ages, through these various experiences of climactic changes in human history. All of our ancestors participated in some way with securing that food as a possibility and being in relationship with these plants with that gratitude. So those are the 4 things of the farming as medicine model. And we are tracking from a data standpoint, what happens to the health of the soil, what happens to the water, what happens to the people, what happens to the beaver, what happens with the storytelling around what it means to come back to land and re-enter relationship. You know, sometimes in this ecological movement, I'll hear people talking about the earth like a sacred, like, why can't we, live in relationship to the wild, right? I'm like, why can't you live in a relationship with your Black neighbor? Why are you shooting that child in the head when they're coming to ring on a doorbell, right? So there's a sickness, there's a level of sickness that's there that needs to be identified and thrown out because it's preventing us from re-entering the sacred circle of humanity. That's actually what is required right now on such an urgent level. So that we can shore up as we go through this very tiny, we're threading the needle. And so that's what we're hoping this farm, my husband speaks a lot about this concept of farming for refugia. So knowing that in the last ice age, there were these places that held that biodiversity, let's create those farms now. And I'm sure, Fred, that you're already doing that. And I'm sure my husband, I'm sure we'd love to come visit you and have you come visit this farm. So that's what I'm really taken with these ideas. And I think that the interconnectedness requires the mind of an artist. And I can see you both are artists, that you have to have a creative, you have to see beyond what our world is offering us right now and kind of drag people along with that vision.
Let me just say a couple of words, Rupa, and then Merlin, turn it to you to say, but I couldn't agree more with everything you had to say, Rupa. And, we've broken our relationships with our mother, huh? And we've done it in so many ways. And you're talking about, how do we get back to really a deep understanding and appreciation that we're members of nature's communities, huh? What we do to them, ultimately, we do to ourselves. And only by nurturing and nourishing them can we nourish ourselves. And that involves all the things you were talking about, including this sense of community, the isolation that we've gotten to as peoples. I think, in my experience, I won't tell stories, but we've broken all of that, huh? And I've seen it during my lifetime. I've lived long enough to see what was it like in my great-grandparents and parents' generation, the relationships that were there even then compared with now. And we've broken all those relationships from extended families, our own extended families and clans, which creates tremendous kind of support, and then their relationship with the land. So anyway, I'll let Merlin speak now, but I just wanted to second everything that you're saying and can talk more about ways that we're trying to do that around the globe too.
Thank you, Rupa. This amazing project. Wonderful to hear about it. And I love I love hearing about it coming out of what you were saying about the immune system, which I think is such a good example. You know, we were always taught I was always taught, and I believe others were also always taught that the immune system was there to defend self from other, which depends, of course, on being able to locate a boundary. You can't police a boundary that you can't locate. So it presumes a hard boundary, which you could then police. If there's no hard boundary, you can't police the boundary. And so, of course, the more reformed way, you might call it, way of thinking about the immune system is that it's a system in which we have learned to balance and regulate the populations of microbes that we are. That it's about allowing relationships to happen in ways which are generative and helpful to a larger whole, rather than unhelpful. And so when you talk about the farm and thinking about the frogs and thinking about the frogs and as a sort of indicator of how beautiful your pepper rows are, and the soil is bursting with life, and thinking about the watershed, not just the neat boundaries of that property as it is written on a legal deed. This is all really wonderful to hear, and to think about the people, of course, thinking about the people that are eating the food, to think about the systems, the social systems that you're plugging into. So yeah, thrilled to hear about that. And I love so much this image of, you know, we talk about relationships so often, I do all the time, as if we had two entities. Let's say we had a relationship between two entities. There are two entities and we have a sort of dotted line between those entities. I used to draw these diagrams at school. And that presumes that these entities are separate entities which can then secondarily be related, which is a nonsense, because usually these relationships they braid through time, and we are co-creative with the entities that we relate with. So it's more like there's an Escher picture, that the artist Escher, of a hand drawing a hand, drawing a hand, drawing a hand. It's more like that. Where you have a sort of shimmering relational field between these entities that are doing the relating, and it's not like you could think about the entities without the relationship. So even when we start turning towards views of interrelationality and so forth, it's still easy to fall into these old patterns of thinking, as if we just had to join the dots. So that's, yeah, just a thought on the subject of relationship and how we imagine it, and which was triggered by hearing about how you're putting into practice in such a beautiful way. And it reminds me, of course, that so much of the modern biological and ecological sciences are leading us to this place, but really it's as if it was discovery, but really it feels like remembering. It feels like remembering something that humans have known for a very long time, in all sorts of different parts of the world, in traditional knowledge systems. And so, yeah, a remembering of something that we've forgotten, rather than discovering something which is some kind of novel fact.
Merlin, to follow on what you're saying, I often think of different kinds of knowledge. And we've gotten, since the 17th century, so into scientific kind of ways of analyzing and looking at systems. But the knowledge of how to function in systems far predates any kind of scientific knowledge, right? The knowledge of relationships with organisms and all the plants and animals and different creatures in the environment. And I think we forget that that's a tremendously valuable source of knowledge, that as we've gone since the 17th century and got more and more into science and we try to understand it. And not that that's a bad thing. I think there's value in that. But then we forget that there's this other kind of knowledge that comes to people's bodies through their hands, through working with systems, huh? And that's what we've lost, is that kind of knowledge of I think over the years. And I often think too, kind of randomly, people in ecology often talk about complex adaptive systems. Adaptive. To me, that's a very, very passive view. I think of it as complex creative systems. By participating, we're all, I think, creating. We're participating in creating. And this idea that you both have talked about on boundaries, you know, I often think all boundaries are arbitrary. We invent them, and then ironically, we find ourselves trapped within them, huh? From this standpoint, we create all that. Anyway, just a couple.
Yeah, I think about that also with there's the concept of rhizomatic education, like how we learn through multiple forms of learning. In medicine, we're terrible at this. So in my work in medicine is really to bring theories and ideas and practices that decolonize what we're doing here. And there's the, very real experience of patients. For example, in medicine, we undertreat Black pain because of, again, these old colonial entities that Black people actually don't feel the way that other people do. And it's so deeply thick in our minds that medical residents today still undertreat. It's like it happens every day. Even the most like woke medical institutions such as UCSF. I just had a meeting today with a group who were like, yeah, we're just seeing patient after patient after patient. And so how do you take a system that was based in this sort of reductive, like you're talking about the 17th century reductionism, when we have so much data and knowledge to show not only how ineffective or violent and cruel it is, but how ineffective it is. And then on the other hand, you'll have these situations where, for example, I have a patient. He is a Black man. I've been seeing him in the hospital for about 20 years. And he was in the hospital. He has a chronic illnesses back and forth. And he was in the hospital and he was asking me, how's your band doing? Because I've been touring around the world with my band for 15 years and COVID shut that all down. And I was like, oh man, I'm not playing with a band because I can't possibly invite people together to hear me sing when they'll all get COVID. So there's this like ethical conundrum. I can't actually perform for people right now. But I'm like, so I'm farming. I'm like farming with my husband and we're like hella farming down the coast. And we're giving away all this food. And we're growing all these heirloom varieties and what people want us to grow. And then we're bringing it up to the city and we're giving it away for free. And he looks at me and he says, wait a minute, was that you who brought that speckled lettuce to Booker T, Washington, to where I get my food every Friday? And I was like, that was us. And he said, just when I saw the way it was laid out, I immediately felt cared for. And he got tears in his eyes and then I got tears in my eyes. And I'm like, how do you quantify that in medicine? That this person, by looking at this lettuce that was made available to him at no cost and seeing the beauty of that lettuce, and it became a talking point, right? He'd bring it home. Where'd you get that lettuce? Neighbors would be like, where'd you get that? I've never seen that lettuce. Oh, well, this is, where this is the farmer that's great. This is where it's been great. And then there's a whole story, right? And we talk about boundaries and the boundlessness of story, right? So how knowledge is communicated through story is a very different kind of knowledge than to the molecules of benefit from the lettuce leaf, right? Into the biology of the person. But how do you quantify the biology of feeling cared for and what that does for that person?
Absolutely.
And
what does
something
that do? What does that do for the health of that person, huh? We know the placebo effect is 30% or more in everything that goes on, huh? And these can be powerful kind of placebo effects. Makes me think, I'm working on 3 papers for a holistic veterinary journal, but one of those, a friend in Alaska was telling me about the native peoples up there. They don't like to eat any kind of domesticated foods, whether it be animal or plant products. They feel that the native plants and animals are what really gives them health. And it's amazing, their relationship with the foods and with the plants and animals, whether it's fishes or whatever it is. And when they go into the hospital, this is why I'm bringing this, when they go into the hospital, that's the kinds of foods that they're given. Those are comfort foods for them. They say it's not all this other stuff. And they feel that in terms of their health, it's these wild plants and wild animals. And one could talk about the wild plants, and you're mentioning heirloom species, but we've selected for yield and transportability and appearance and all these things that have nothing to do with phytochemical richness of foods. That hasn't happened in these native species. They are still, you taste those and you get the punch of all this chemistry that's helpful for you. And they couldn't tell you all the phenols and polyphenols and terpenes and alkaloids and all that stuff. It's not relevant. What they know is this makes me healthy, and this is what I need to maintain my health. So anyway, it relates to what you're saying, huh? And these people know that they haven't lost that. They haven't lost that as part of their culture.
Yes, and one of the things, Fred, that makes me sad is that in our research, looking at the wild foods up in Alberta, let's say in Canada, so many of those places have been impacted by the fossil fuel industry. And so the presence now of heavy metals, the presence of these benzenes and these chemicals that cause so much illness, that it's becoming, it's hard to find places on planet Earth that are untouched by the violence of this industry. And so that those foods are, even though they have all these health benefits, now they have these risks. And that to me is it's so depressing. There was even my son, we live in a place in California where there used to be a drought before there were floods. And he was like, well, maybe we can harvest the fog. He's like 9 years old. He's like, let's do some fog harvesting. Let's do some tests. And so we started setting up prototypes and measuring and all this. And then we found some papers about the presence of mercury in the whiskers of mountain lions who live in the fog belt, right? So it's like, you can't even get the fog. The whole planet has been perverted in this way. And it's going to take so many generations to unfuck the planet. And it's a good time to start now. But it's going to require a fight, because these people who want, even like when you go to the COP, I went to speak at COP 27 in Egypt, and it was like a trade show for the end of times. It's all these capitalists who are like, how do I keep making money off this while the ship is sinking? It's disgusting. And then that's the mind view. It's like, you actually can't have interconnectedness in a system that forces the exploitation either of humans and the earth. You can't have it. So what we're talking about right now is not something that can coexist with that. So what can we do? We can organize. We must organize. We must withhold our labor. We must collectively join with people around the world who are saying, you know what? We're done participating. We need a system that's going to nurture the earth. It has to be, it will be, and it must be an engaged fight. Because if you look at
amen to all of that. And I think all the time, how do we move from totally unconscious state, right, of all this, to raising the level of consciousness of people in general, so that we all come to realize what's going on. I often think too locally, so it's wonderful what you're doing with your farm, and it's wonderful what's happening with the regenerative movement and whatever you want to call it around it. To me, that's so positive and reaching out to people. But we can't all be farmers and ranchers. So I think, what can we do? And I think this little place where we live in Montana here, have neighbors all around. We own a couple of acres, each of us, and it's not a good place, rock pile. But you know what? You can encourage all the native species. We have people walk down the road here and they say, where did you get all these beautiful plants? And we said, well, that's what nature grows here. That's what nature grows. And so you've got this tremendous diversity of plants that's doing what? It's creating life below ground and above ground. And then we grow herbal, vegetable, medicinal little gardens. We've planted hundreds of, I'm not trying to make this like boasting. I'm just saying, what can you do? We've planted hundreds of berry producing shrubs, native, the serviceberry included, that wildlife can use, that we can use, but we can all become little farmers and ranchers. And what's that get you out of? You quit using much water, which is scarce, because native plants don't need to be irrigated, right? You quit using fossil fuels to irrigate, cut, and put pesticides on lawns, right? You look at the amount of money that's spent just cutting lawns. It's unbelievable when you look at EPA figures on that. You look at the amount of water. Then you look at the amount of, because your lawn can't have one weed in it, right? So the amount of herbicides you use, it's phenomenal. So if we got people thinking, okay, so Rupa's doing this amazing thing, but you can do that in your little place too, if you have any piece of ground. So how do we get people thinking that way, and then thinking that way in terms of where we can be a community, and we could actually, we raise some chickens here, bees, you could create life around you, and think about, how do we create life, and how do we create communities that value that come to realize that all that you were saying, it's not good. And I don't know how long we're going to be able to persist with this kind of way that we've been treating Mother Earth,
I see the question. Merlin, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I like what you said about organizing. I feel like there are so many to think about organizing, and it's a word that can sound a little like a bit of a turn off. I don't think it's a turn off, but I love this sense of coming together across disciplines, across social background, across ancestral background, across professional disciplinary background, across age differences, to form new lichens, to form new symbiotic fluid complexes that have adaptive ingenuity and capability, because this is really what is the story of life. Like, if we look back through the 5 enormous extinction events, the level of crisis is kind of difficult for us to conceive. In each of these events, vast numbers of lineages went extinct, and it's often in these times of crisis that new relationships form, that new enduring symbiotic relationships form. And we're in a time of crisis, and there are ways for us to relate to one another, ways for us to find new ways to relate, to share perspective, to share knowledge, to share ways of knowing, ways of thinking, ways of feeling, ways of expressing, ways of making art, ways of doing science, whatever. And I feel like that's a superpower, and something that will really allow us to behave like adaptive organisms have behaved for a very long time.
First of all, thank you so much, everybody, for this very vital discussion and trying to bring it back to some participatory ways of looking into our local environment to create a place in which thriving can manifest. And I'm thinking of an example, and there's an example of when we start to think of these different ways of knowing. There's a process of endosymbiosis where information, in some sense, from a genealogical perspective, is brought forth from this idea of organisms inhabiting other organisms. And we look as an example in the human body as an example, with the production or the energy production of mitochondria as an example. We're looking at an organelle species that is, in some sense, ancient, that's primordial. And there's this sense of bringing forth, an organismic bringing forth. And that's what I'm hearing a lot of what the three of you are referring to as. There's this innate wisdom or capacity that we're attempting through different practical ways to allow to flourish. And obviously I think food is very, how do we say this? Food is integral to this process because it's what we interface with on a daily basis. It's what sustains us in so many different ways. We're consuming literally or interfacing with this photosynthetic yield through what's taking place through whatever it is that we're consuming. And in that sense, it's information transfer. And I'm trying to relate to all of these different things, but I think looking at some of the questions, what's the practicality to a lot of these things? We go back to think like fermented vegetables, fermented products, and things like that. Merlin, I think you have a background in some of these things. You have an interest, I think, for different fermented products. And then listening to what Fred is saying, how planting our own fruits and vegetables and native plants that are relative to our area. And then some of the work that Rupa is doing which is on a slightly larger scale. Farming, how do we construct different farming practices? And I think regenerative is this place that we can hopefully gain a lot more traction on, if I'm hearing everybody correctly. So these are some of the things I'm hearing. But going back to the comments, the practicality of this, what are some of the things on the daily basis that we can refer to and even learn how to procure different types of things?
I just want to answer that because this goes to a central thesis in our book, which is the concept of deep medicine. So the way in which doctors will talk to you about your heart disease and your diabetes is to choose better foods. It's an individual problem. You've got a problem. You need to diet and exercise a little bit more. That to me is a form of medical gaslighting when the entire system around your body is generating so much toxicity and stress that there's no way any of us are going to be able to avoid diabetes and cancer and Alzheimer's and all of these diseases, because it's not just about what you're eating. It's about how your body is able to process or not process it based on the level of inflammatory presence, the immune system dysregulation. And so I would just advocate for, like, fermented foods, that's great. Let's talk about like what you could do, plant your garden, but it's not about each individual. Sure, each individual have a relationship to the earth. Yes, please do. Everyone should. But this is really about structures, and it's about mindsets, cosmologies, worldviews. So if there's a worldview of I'm going to get enough for me and my family, and that's it, and to hell with the rest, and I'm going to use regenerative agriculture to do it, because right now Kellogg is talking a whole bunch of regenerative agriculture. And I'm in the room with people from around the world who are talking about regenerative agriculture. And there's some of the worst stinking capitalists that will watch this planet go underwater, and they'll have their boat and they'll have their rocket and they'll head to Mars. That is not, it's important to call a spade and name it, that the problem is the cosmology. The problem is the worldview that is not allowing us to be integrated and to act in a holistic fashion. So by giving individual solutions or positing like what you can do as a person, that's why I say organize, that we must actually become like a fungal network all over the world. We must act in a rhizomatic fashion. We must act without a central nervous system, but in a coordinated, communicative way to overthrow and resist and refuse to participate with a system that is destroying the earth. And that means liberating the food system, because in order for people to refuse to show up for work, they need three things. They need food, they need medicine, they need shelter. And so if there can be alternative ways to provide that for community, they will have more of an imagining. It's like, I can step off of this McJob because I have my food, I have my medicine, I have my shelter, I have these things taken care of. So I can start to imagine, how can I participate in this great turning, in this great moment where humanity is being called upon to be something more than what we've been the last 600 years. We're being called upon to step into our ancestral power to heal each other and to heal the earth and to heal our damaged relationships. Melvin said something, adaptive ingenuity, and Merlin said something, adaptive ingenuity. I think about that. I think that's a very powerful phrase, like to create new lichens. I love that. We need to imagine new kinds of relationships. And I do think from a pragmatic standpoint, like policy level, let's make food a human right. Let's make not just food, but food grown on farms using agroecology mandatory for everybody who lives in our urban environments. Then immediately turn the faucet on to start funding jobs for young farmers. So people, like right now, what's the average age of a farmer in the United States? It's scary. We've got these like 20-year-old urban indigenous youth who've never touched the ground, who are signing up to learn agroecology because they know that there's an emergency. The top number one request from all these community meetings we're going to is people saying, we need to learn how to grow our own food. We need to learn how to grow our own medicine. People want this knowledge and they're hungry for it. So let's start opening the levers of power to flood the resources. Let's take those farms that are going to be underwater in California, Tulare Lake. I mean, let's just let that shit flood for a couple of years, wash out that toxic farmland, and take that land away from the Resnicks and break it up into a small, like thousands of small agroecological farms for young people to have jobs to heal the earth, to take care of that earth that's been abused, and to start growing polycultural environments that can thrive based in a native plant repertoire that knows, like Fred was saying, how to grow the berries, the tremendous abundance of food that used to be here, that doesn't require the kind of aqueducts and systems that we have right now. We don't need to give almonds to the whole world. We just need to feed the people and heal the earth. And so if we could start reorienting our policy to reflect what the earth is demanding that we do from a health standpoint, we would be in much better shape. So that's why I say organize, because I think that we actually have to do it collectively.
I agree, Rupa. What you're talking about too makes me think of something I read recently in Mother Earth News, and it was about a place called the Farm at Okefenokee. And it's a new way to envision development. And in this particular one, there's 702 acres, and they're going to grow all of their own food, plant and animal foods alike. But on that, they have low-cost housing that's restricted to different parts. And think of what kind of a community that creates. And so the homeowners' fees go for permanent labor that would be taking care of the farm, but you as a participant can participate all you want and as your time is able. And so it's creating a totally different kind of community in these places that you're talking about. And one was talking with a lady yesterday, and she said, and probably the kind of neighbors you would really like to have too would be out on those places. One way or another on that. But to me, it's like, this makes sense. It's how can we come together, low cost, right? Not these mega mansion kind of things. What a person actually needs. You've got a place where you're producing your own food. You put yourself back in touch on a scale that can support all of your folks, and then probably more as well. To me, it's like, wow, my wife and I have just been talking nonstop about that. And we don't know if we've got the energy still at this point in the game for us. We're not spring chickens anymore, but it's like, what a fabulous idea to do those kind of things. And I haven't gotten into this, and I won't take us down this path, but I think a lot from the standpoint of how plant diversity creates life below ground, how it's good for the plants themselves, how that for domestic animals, when you have diverse arrays of plants, their health goes up. And I could give examples starting in the womb, even for the fetus, but their health goes up because they have nourishment. They can self-medicate prophylactically as well as therapeutically if they need it, on and on and on. But what we're doing research-wise, Stefan Van Vliet, we're showing that when they have access to that, meat and dairy from those animals is vastly richer in phytochemical nutrients. It's healthier. It's anti-inflammatory, not pro-inflammatory. It's got some of these compounds can accumulate in amounts that are what we would consider in plants to be health beneficial. So it's these linkages I think about, and then how do you create those kind of things across landscapes that are building health below ground, building health above ground, and we're linked in with it. And then, by the way, the flavors of meat and dairy that come from this rich array of herbs are greatly enhanced. Why? Because the cells and organ systems, as we've been talking about in our body, know that. That's what they need. And what you were saying, Sam, early on, the work we did on metabolically mediated flavor feedback relationships, that's what's that about, is that cells and organ systems are influencing liking for food as a function of need, food and medicine both. And when you get in tune with that, you've got this wisdom of the body that doesn't need to know all the details, it just needs to know. But you have to have suitable alternatives, good, wholesome foods available to creatures, including us.
Merlin, I see that you're unmuted, so if you wanted to go for it, it's all yours.
I had a thought. There's a wonderful story about the jazz musician Thelonious Monk, and he was playing with his band, and one of the players played a wrong note, let's say. And Monk reharmonized the piece on the fly to to envelop this wrong note within a new field of harmony, a new field of stability. So what had at first seemed like a mistake became a prompt for greater possibility. Dissonance became a generative dissonance. And I wonder if there are ways that we can bring our full selves to think about our current situation in this kind of way, where we can take many of the dissonances and horrible problems that are playing out around the world in numberless ways, and to think about those as opportunities to catalyze new brilliance and new beauty. And it feels to me like that's a way of thinking that will help me continue to think about this process of living as a process of creation, a process of being an artist that will keep me getting out of bed in the morning. And I just wanted to throw that in to both of you to see what you thought.
Merlin, really quickly, and then Rupa, you can respond. But I couldn't agree more. And you know, in mythology, world mythologies, over and over again, they talk about how trials transform consciousness, right? So one could look at this as like global trials that creating opportunities, right? Creating opportunities for us to awaken, to wake up, to become conscious. So I think that's absolutely how I look at the whole thing. Is okay, so here we are. Who cares? I don't even think about whose fault it is. We all do the best we can with what we have at the time, right? And we can look back and say, well, boy, that was sure wrong, and that was wrong, and that was wrong. People may look back in 50 years and say, boy, how naive we were about this kind of stuff we're talking about. But you do the best you can, and you continue to work with those notes, right? Those the off notes, and you do the best you can, and use that as ways to transform, how to continually transform in the face of ever-changing environments. I totally agree with you. I think that's the way. And to think it, I don't like to say problems, the word I like to think always challenges and opportunities, and we've got some major ones now. But then, you know, that's why it's good to have these kind of conversations, right, with one another, and then we all conversing with people all over the place about the conversation, about how do we wake up, and how do we use these trials to transform consciousness, as they say always in mythology. Trials transform consciousness. They can wake you up. So it's a long-winded way to say I totally agree.
Yeah, I also love that, Merlin. Thank you. The opportunity to hear another song, to hear another harmony, to see how the shift of frame of reference can change the song, and create something, a possibility of beauty and a possibility of imaginings that wasn't there in like 10 years ago. So here in California, when we wake up surrounded by fires, right, and the sky is orange, and then a few years later, the bridges are washed out and this lake is reappearing, right? So Tulare Lake it's been drained for a century. The whole plain of California that's been farmed in this terrible way, where the fungi have all been obliterated by the chemical warfare of industrial farming. And the topsoil used to be so rich, like 20 feet thick, and now it's like 6 inches. And I drive through the valley on a windy day, and it's no wonder that all my patients, you see this rise in coccidiomycosis, all the toxic fungi or pathogenic fungi are like in people's lungs, right? And I just see this system out of balance. But then here it is coming back, and everyone's waiting for this big melt in California. So we have 233% the snowpack that we usually do. And it's gonna melt, and the valley is going to declare itself as a wetland, which is what it is. No matter how much the water has been incarcerated, and the beaver has been extirpated, and the salmon have been destroyed, but the water will declare, it will declare the presence of this wetland. And in that, I've been thinking, I haven't written a single song since COVID, but this lake is just singing to me in my sleep that, oh my God, she's coming back. And I told my husband, I'm like, we got to drive there and just watch the snow melt. Like, that's what we got to do. And then like May, we just have to go watch the snow melt. And he was laughing at me. But I thought about that. It's like, yes, okay, livelihoods will be lost. But livelihoods based on what? And it's a chance and an opportunity to help move people's imaginings to different kinds of livelihoods. And Fred, every community needs elders. So although you might not have the energy to build, they're going to need you to guide, right? And so these ideas of agrohoods, this is a concept that we're working with on the coast because all our farmers need housing, and they're all young people in their 20s. They're like, how the hell do we have housing in a place that's, you got Neil Young with his estate over here, and all these people have commandeered the space to make these conservation spaces that have driven up land scarcity for the workers who tend to be brown. And so you got the shooting like you saw in Half Moon Bay with the worker who was living in a trailer and being paid $9 an hour, right? So that's the reality of our agricultural system. So having conversations right now with Peninsula Open Space Trust, hey, you guys have 88,000 acres. Why not open up 40 acres for a vision of what farmer housing should look like? And create real housing, create housing that's based, that's ecologically sound and beautiful, create a system where people will feel dignified in their homes, and that the earth will be cared for. It doesn't have to be this way where people are degraded. It actually really shouldn't be that way, because when we're not degraded, we participate in a different way. And what you're saying, Fred, is that our participation is mandatory. And I do believe actually everyone must become a farmer. And if not a farmer, a tender of soil, a tender of the soil that we are a part of. Everyone must start to understand that if what they're walking on is not healthy, they are not healthy. That they're intimately connected to that system. So that's, I do. Yeah, I do believe these things, and I'm grateful, Merlin, for your writing. I just want to say that your language and your research and the way that you presented it, I read your stuff and I share it with my children. It awakens the imagination of the possibilities of who we are. And that's what I see we're at the precipice of right now, is a great shift in our consciousness of who we actually are. When someone said remembering, we're not discovering, we're remembering who we are as interconnected beings who are part of this holobiont known as planet Earth. So it's exciting. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Rupa. We're closing in on time, and I want to be very respectful of the three of your busy schedules. Samantha, I think you had your hand up a little bit earlier. Maybe the time has passed, but if you do want to, you've unmuted.
I did, but no, I don't remember.
That's
There
okay.
was something about when Dawn had said about like, what can we do?
Right.
And there were two things that I was thinking about. One is about shifting how do we shift this idea of the individual mentality of what can I and me and my get for me and mine and my family and my me and more. And then how do we shift that to a collective we? That's something that I see as being something that we as in faculty or instructors, people who are in a community college atmosphere can do on one level. Two is about, I'm trying to do a lot of work with empathy and trying to understand the language of empathy and how when we do love something like a family member, whether or not we're individualistic, for example, that when we do love something and when we're able to see that from their perspective, for example, if we are able to look at the earth and put ourselves in the earth's shoes or in animals' shoes. Having that empathy for the earth is something I think that if we can learn how to talk about that, is something that's important. I'm not sure I articulated that correctly. And then the other part was about, I live in Long Beach, and one thing that I have done that I was a practical measure that I do see local water departments, for example, in Southern California, trying to eliminate the yard. And I know of at least 10 houses in my neighborhood, for example, who have, and yes, it is incentivized by getting rebates back, for example, to dismantle your green lawn and put native plants in. And so I have hummingbirds and bees. It's a sanctuary for monarch butterflies, and even just that. And if we are able to get into those small things, but if money is where it hits money, then that might be a way also to incentivize people through either in Southern California to money and or time and convenience. I see that as time and convenience as being something that is a reason why people don't make the right choices, for example. So that's all and if anybody ever has any ideas about speaking with empathy and how we speak with empathy, I've been working a lot with Tibetan monks, and I'm really trying to pick their brains about how do we speak not only about all sentient beings, but how do we then incorporate this into plants and the land like Native Americans do, as far as thinking of it as your brother and your sister, so that we're able to speak about it that way. Then we're able to then care for that in our own lives and care. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Sorry, I don't want to. That's it. It's really more comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. I just want to share my thoughts as a doctor. We've all failed the empathy challenge, and I just want to say that out loud with COVID. So I'm watching an elder die right now of COVID because people just don't want to wear masks. So if we look at just even that like very trivial, very small action of wearing a mask, I have seen just horrific human behavior over a slight change in your convenience to ensure that everyone could be safe and participate in a public space. And we fail that. So before I want to talk about empathy for plants, I'd like to talk about empathy for elders and empathy for children and empathy for people who are immunocompromised so they can participate in public gathering. Because COVID is taking 1,700 people a week in the United States, their lives still. And we still haven't figured out that it just requires all of us adjusting our behavior a little bit to make sure everyone can be safe. So I say that to sort of ground us in the reality of where we're at as a human species, that we've seen tantrums like I can't even believe. Even here in the hospital, doctors who are like, I don't want to have to wear a mask. I'm like, you are taking care of people who are immunocompromised. Why is that a problem for you to do that? Why is it's such a tragedy for you to have to wear a mask to make sure you don't spread virus from person to person? The insult to the individual is so great, even for people who call themselves liberal or consider themselves environmentalists or consider themselves deeply empathic, that they don't want to wear a mask. So Samantha, if you're like masking everywhere you can go and you're like not eating indoors right now while the virus is spreading, and you're making sure that elders can participate in ways that are totally safe so that they don't have to die just because they attend a family function, and that's what we're seeing in the hospital, that's when I feel like we're ready to have these bigger conversations. But right now, as a human consciousness, we aren't there. We're not even, we have failed. We have seen 20 million people leave this earth at least in the last 3 years. We haven't even stopped to grieve that. We haven't even gone, holy shit, what just happened? There's a deep, deep disconnect in humanity right now on our ability to care for one another. And so I do celebrate and think, yeah, we all need to reconnect with Mama Earth, but we can't even connect with the elders in our community to make sure they can go to the grocery store safely, we got some big problems. We got a big chasm to get beyond. And I worry about that. This was what keeps me up at night as a working doctor. I don't know what, Merlin, do you have any solace or balm for my soul there?
I agree. It's a big deal. We have a huge empathy deficit, and not just with regard to COVID. And I think about the epidemic of loneliness that kills people. Think about, I mean, there's so many, I won't even list that, but there are so many levels, there's so many places within the medicalized world where we see this happening. And COVID is one almighty example. And there are so many, and it really, yeah, it's worrying. I don't know if that's the place we want to end, but maybe that's just where we're going to end.
I'll add one story to that about empathy. It's a Buddhist kind of story. So people in regenerative ag are into soils and plants and so forth. And I was told about a field trip recently where several folks were out and they dug up this plant. They dug it up to look at its roots and to look at what's happening with the plant. So just dig it up. Ooh. And then the group started to walk off. One man turned around and went back, put that plant back into the soil, covered it with dirt. To me, that's an empathy. That's a realization that is a living being. Not only is it conscious with 20 senses or more, it's probably sentient as well. To me, it's trying to get that sense of relationship with all beings, all beings. And if you do it with a plant and you do it with an insect, to me, odds are you can start to do it with all creatures, including humans. If you start to put yourself, this isn't just some plant, everybody walks off. To me, that's amazing. Huh? The first that you dig it up, to me, that's about empathy. Another way of thinking about how do we relate to everything in the world, including other human beings.
Thanks, Fred. I just had one quick thought that so much it seems to be to do with if we don't feel that other people are neighbors, co-journeyers, co-inhabitants, ultimately part of the human family, then it's very easy to forget other people's feelings. It's very easy to prioritize it. But when you have an experience with someone in your own family who has this illness, someone in your own family who's died from this, a best friend whose parent has this affliction, that's when you start to see people having awakenings where they're finding new types of empathy in places that they didn't realize were there, growing new faculties for empathy. So I wonder whether we can think about this as a failure on the part of societies, organizations, individuals, to create situations for us to connect with, to meet, to come to know others, and maybe something in that coming to know could help us to find empathy in ways that we thought we didn't have.
Yeah,
both with humans and non-humans. Sorry, both with humans and non-humans.
Yes, and I think that for me, the first step is grieving, and an opportunity that we have from the dissonant note of all this loss and ecological destruction is the opportunity to grieve. And when we grieve in community, we are creating new possibilities. So that's where I've been thinking about the power of grief ritual and grief rituals with people we don't know, but who are living side by side with us, as opportunities to get to create new ways of talking and relating to each other. But that there has to be a composting, there has to be a relinquishing of just what Merlin was saying, like a way of being or thinking that has run its course. It's showing us where it's heading us off a cliff. And we actually have to invent ways of reattaching, because we don't have that right now. Most of us have lost the ceremonies and the rituals. Most of us have lost these things that all of our ancestors had. So we have to create them. And it's that to me is a creative and exciting opportunity.
That's very well said, Rupa. And thank you both, Fred and Merlin, for your thoughts as well. But there is, I think, some hope and optimism in how we continue to navigate through, I think, these different ways of knowing and cultivating different ways of knowing. So I really thank the three of you for bringing about a sense of that for all of us today, and for those who may view this at a later date. Three different backgrounds, but with three overlapping sentiments, and a sense of sincerity to the way in which you approach your work and your sense of being and becoming in the world. So I want to leave it at that and just say thank you very much, because I speak on behalf of everybody here that this has been a big learning process and opportunity for reflection from what you have encouraged us to navigate in different ways. So thank you so much for being here today, Merlin, Fred, and Rupa, and continue to be yourselves in this world and with your work, and hopefully we have another opportunity maybe somewhere down the road to cross paths again. But thank you.